When I first heard about the character Meursault from Albert Camus' The Stranger, my first thought was, hey, that reminds me of Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm. I don't remember when this happened or who was telling me about the book, but the loose similarities stuck around in my mind, even when I eventually got around to actually reading it. Early on in The Stranger, I realized my assumption was way off. Meursault was apathetic to the level of Larry David, but Larry David operated on a totally different level of antisocial behavior. Meursault showed no remorse for shooting a stranger, but he never went out of his way to steal flowers from a dead woman's memorial to avoid buying his own, or spent thousands of dollars opening a spite store to put his frenemy out of business. But when I reached the halfway point of the novel, where Meursault ends up on trial, with his acquaintances acting as lukewarm character witnesses and the prosecutor getting severely off topic, the scene suddenly felt very familiar. Famously, the series finale of Seinfeld sees its four protagonists put on trial for violating a fictional Good Samaritan law by laughing at a fat man being robbed instead of trying to help. 26 years later, Larry David's self-starring spiritual sequel Curb Your Enthusiasm repeated this plot point in its own series finale, which was called No Lessons Learned. Some people think that Seinfeld's finale was meant as a tribute to The Stranger, not just because it takes place in a courtroom, but more specifically because the testimonies are written to reveal the way our protagonists are totally incapable of following social norms. On the most surface level, The Stranger, No Lessons Learned, and the Seinfeld finale all pile on the evidence that their protagonists are incapable of showing empathy or of even faking empathy like everyone else. On a deeper level, Camus and Larry David use this beautifully simple premise to question the very nature of a culture that has been collectively manufactured to rely on a flimsy structure of social expectations. By the way, the books, shows, and albums we're going to be discussing here today aren't exactly lighthearted kids' fare, even the comedies, so consider yourself warned about dark themes spoken of in light tones. Curb Your Enthusiasm, and Seinfeld before it, derive their humor from the social interactions of the antisocial yet socially aware protagonists. Larry David's refusal to engage in unanimous social conventions usually leads him into one of two opposite but identical scenarios. Either Larry flouts a social convention for any number of reasons, to the annoyance of everyone around him, or another character flouts a social convention and Larry calls them out on it, in which case the social norm they're ignoring is usually less universal and sometimes a rule only Larry seems aware of. For instance, in the first scenario, Larry will fake a developmental disability to prevent someone from sharing his office.
Hello! How are you?
Or casually compliment a friend on the size of his son's penis, apparently just trying to be nice and thinking this is a totally normal thing to say.
Why would you do that, Larry?
I took a risk.
In the second scenario, Larry will call out an ice cream shop customer abusing her free sample privileges, or a friend who has told everyone about his anonymous donation to earn himself double points for generosity and humility. When both occur at the same time, Larry may find himself lying about his uncle molesting him to fit in at an incest survivors group, while at the same time telling his friend that the abuse she suffered wasn't technically incest, so she really shouldn't be here.
And he pretended to be an incest survivor named Todd.
Unlike Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld, Camus' Meursault has pretty much no sense of humor. He's also pretty much apathetic towards himself and his own life, whereas Larry David is self-serving to the point of alienating his friends, often for no greater purpose than to prove his opinions are correct, or, more importantly, that other people's opinions are wrong. The Stranger famously begins with the line, "Mama died today." Or yesterday, maybe, I don't know, implying from the start that even Meursault's mother holds no significant place in his heart. Meursault is berated throughout the novel for his decision to keep his mother in a nursing home. Not an uncommon decision nowadays, but according to the novel, a nearly unspeakable act of betrayal in 20th century French Algeria, despite the fact that the nursing home exists in the first place. Even when on trial for murder, it's Meursault's disinterest in his mother, and his indifference towards her death, that the prosecutor leans on to get the jury riled up. To make a specific comparison to imply a general theme, one episode of Curb revolves around Larry finding out that his mother is dead and that no one bothered to tell him until after the funeral, due to his mother's final command to not bother him while he was out of town. While Larry reacts with surprise, which is more than can be said of Meursault, at least in his form as narrator, he's visibly more annoyed at not being told than he is upset at his mother being dead. Even when Larry has an out-of-body experience and runs into his late mother, he's more preoccupied with defending his attitude than making amends. In fact, the rest of the episode sees Larry using his mother's death to avoid any and all social responsibilities, an example of Larry manipulating his peers' adherence to social norms for his benefit, instead of outwardly contesting them for his benefit. Hypothetically, if one of Larry's friends lost his mother that same episode, Larry would presumably refuse to take this loss as an excuse for his friend not to play golf or do whatever prearranged favor would benefit Larry personally. Larry's sympathy lessens even further when the tragedy in question doesn't affect him personally. For instance, when Larry accidentally inspires his friend to attempt suicide, he makes excuses to continue his poker game instead of visiting him in the emergency room. Then once he's finally paid off to make things right, he offends the man again by snacking while apologizing.
You're eating pistachio nuts while you're apologizing to me?
Yeah, I can eat and apologize.
While Larry and Marceau are on opposite ends of the self-serving spectrum, Larry's faux pas with the apology pistachios is similar to Marceau's behavior at his mother's wake. He has no interest in seeing her body, and he smokes near her casket, which isn't not allowed, but is clearly overstepping an unspoken rule. He also takes his funeral coffee with milk, despite the other unspoken rule of the time and place that the coffee should be drunk black while in mourning. We know from Marceau's characterization that he isn't smoking and drinking black coffee to fulfill his sensory desires, or because he enjoys besmirching his mother's memory, but because this is his default state of being. He smokes all the time and sees no reason why he shouldn't keep it up while sitting next to his mother's coffin. On the same note, the relative aliveness of his mother shouldn't have an effect on his usual coffee order. And Marceau didn't refuse to see his mother's body because of some emotional or spiritual reason. He just didn't see the point. When asked why he wouldn't want to take one last look at the woman who raised him, all he can say is, I don't know. One of Marceau's defining traits that separates him from Larry David is his adherence to honesty. Larry is driven by an almost hedonistic need to be right, which leads to him lying all the time, or at least asking questions that the average person would avoid, like whether one can really be called a kamikaze pilot if they survive the war.
There's a lot of kamikaze pilots that are still alive. They are not kamikaze pilots.
Or
Have you thought about the skin color at all? I'm sorry?
Larry's appreciation for honesty extends more often to others than to himself, and he'll go to great lengths to prove that others are lying, or at least hiding their true feelings for the sake of social niceties. This trait of Larry's is reflected in the very title of the show, and vindicated during Larry's above-mentioned near-death experience, when his socially intelligent, voice-of-reason wife suddenly drops her facade of mourning and starts asking about Larry's will. Marceau, on the other hand, wandering through life and enjoying the small things without having any strong opinions, tells the truth because he has no reason to lie, except in the case where lying would benefit someone else. Marceau isn't generous or selfish. He's utilitarian, but only for those who happen to be nearby. Marceau helps his friend Ramon by bearing false witness against his mistress, who Marceau hasn't met, despite knowing that Ramon is physically abusive to her. Marceau shows no empathy for Ramon's mistress, but he doesn't seem to care about helping Ramon either. He lies under oath, just because he was asked to, and it seems plausible that Marceau would have lied about Ramon on behalf of the mistress if she had happened to ask him first. On the same note, when Marceau agrees to marry his lover Marie, she prods him, and he admits that he'd be doing it because she wants it, and that he doesn't even care about making her happy. He's just willing to passively go along with what's asked of him. A general outlook that Marceau doesn't find particularly unusual or amoral. This theme of rejecting emotions in the least zen way possible pops up in another courtroom scene in a different medium, that being Pink Floyd's The Trial, the climactic track of their rock opera The Wall. Inside the mind of Pink Floyd, a fictionalized composite of the real-life band members, a symbolic wall has been built to seal him off from the damaging relationships he's had with the world, with his fans, and with specific individuals like his wife and his mother. While no character in this story is perfect, Pink shows a continuous refusal to accept his own faults or his own role in his failed relationships. The prosecutor in The Wall announces that Pink's crime is the act of showing feelings of an almost human nature, despite his ongoing crusade to lock himself away from any emotions to avoid being hurt again. Unlike Marceau, who doesn't value or disregard ordinary human feelings, Pink has so fully convinced himself that emotions cause only harm that he's created an entire world within his mind where feeling anything is considered the ultimate crime. The Wall satirizes the traditions and roles of the legal system, as we'll also see later when Kafka gets involved, to the point where the judge is quite literally talking out of his ass. Maybe this element of satire is why the judge pronounces Pink guilty of sabotaging his relationships and not showing enough emotion, converse to the original accusation. But regardless of the legal proceedings in the 2D animated world of his subconscious, Pink admits to himself before the trial that it's time for him to accept that he may in fact be his own worst enemy. "I want to go home," he says. "Take off this uniform and leave the show. But I'm waiting in this cell because I have to know. Have I been guilty all this time?" Meursault has no wall in the Pink Floyd sense, or else his wall was built so thick and so tall and at such a young age that it can only be penetrated by the knowledge of his imminent death. After 12 seasons, including a lengthy sequence in heaven, it's safe to say that Larry David doesn't have any wall to speak of. He has feelings, more so than Meursault, but they're less poignant than the trauma responses that led Pink Floyd to build his wall. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the repression, the higher the wall. Funnily enough, a single episode of the notoriously pathos-free Seinfeld implies the existence of a Pink Floyd wall within Jerry. In The Serenity Now, Jerry's girlfriend suspects his blasé attitude to be a form of emotional repression and convinces him to let out his feelings, which results in him becoming overly emotional and even crying, something he's apparently never done before.
What is this salty discharge?
Thanks to Larry David's famous no hugging, no learning rule, this aspect of Jerry's character was never touched on again after he rounded out the episode by zipping himself back up. Jerry has completely suppressed his human emotions to the point where they can only surface in a massive explosion of pent-up fury, as we'll see later with Meursault. Jerry's one-off girlfriend, as well as Marie and Pink Floyd's ex-wife, have discovered the truth in the final line of The Wall. "It's not easy banging your heart against some mad bugger's wall." Unlike Pink, Jerry and Meursault don't seem to have consciously forced their repression due to a lifetime of trauma and failed relationships. They're emotionless and without empathy, but both serve their roles in society, working and paying taxes. The question is whether their lack of empathy is enough of a crime against society to warrant their exclusion from it. Unlike Meursault and Jerry Seinfeld, Larry David is not incapable of empathy. The episode where he invites a convicted sex offender to his Seder meal shows that Larry is capable of overlooking other people's mistakes, as long as they don't indirectly hurt or insult him. Same goes for a later episode where Larry spills coffee on a Klansman's robes and conscientiously pays to have them cleaned, even though they're owned by a man who despises Larry's entire lineage. Larry asks two separate Jewish friends to help him out with the robes, and while you could definitely make the argument that Larry enjoys the shock value of his misadventures, this episode highlights that at the end of the day, Larry believes in the golden rule, treating others how you want to be treated. Unless, that is, you think you can realistically get away with it. Like the fictionalized Jerry of Seinfeld, the fictionalized Larry of Curb waltzes through life with an eye for humor derived from the human condition.
I'm 76 years old, and I have never learned a lesson in my entire life. Oh!
Their general lack of empathy allows both characters to exercise their trademark observational humor, Jerry to find inspiration for his stand-up bits, and Larry to push the envelope regardless of other people's feelings. Larry is fully aware of his chronic tongue-in-cheek attitude. In one episode, he tells a grieving son-in-law that,
Between you and me, my condolences aren't quite as deep as the average person.
I'm picking that up.
then immediately makes the blanket statement that no one is ever sincere when they say, "I love you." The trial scenes of The Stranger, Seinfeld, and Curb Your Enthusiasm are more different in setup than intention. Seinfeld's quartet of selfish yuppies are arrested for breaking a fictional law specifically designed by the writers to shed light on the way their 9-season apathy has hurt the people around them. Larry is arrested in the season 12 premiere for an uncharacteristic act of selflessness, mainly meant to satirize Trump-era election policies, but subsequently enforcing the idea that Larry is better off keeping to himself. Meursault, on a completely different page, is arrested for casually shooting a man for ambiguous reasons, either because the sun was in his eyes, or because after an initial accidental shot he decided he might as well commit, or because he was hoping to feel an emotion stronger than his usual apathy. Regardless of why, Meursault did kill the man known only as the Arab, and that's when his story began to dovetail with the twin finales of Larry David's comedies. While Meursault pleads guilty and Larry not guilty, Both defendants are harshly laid into by the prosecutors, and so are the Seinfeld stars, who are judged collectively for whatever reason. Both series finales use this format to bring back a number of recurring or one-off characters who Larry and or the Seinfelds have hurt with their chronic apathy and general lack of empathy. Funny one-episode plotlines become a succession of sociopathic behaviors when collectively held against the yardstick of a society based on unspoken rules. The secondary characters of The Stranger are also called to the stand, but on the opposite side, being asked to testify to Meursault's good character. They try to defend him, considering him a friend due to his willingness to go along with whatever they're doing, but none of them are able to paint a picture of Meursault that doesn't speak to his incredible disinterest in following social norms, or even being what others would consider a decent person. These failed testimonies fuel the prosecutor, who insists on focusing on Meursault's relationship with his mother. Much like the reader, whose first impression of our narrator was his disinterest in his mother's death, the jury is convinced of Meursault's antisocial drive more by his not particularly terrible treatment of his mother than by his actual admission of guilt. Meursault is given the nickname Mr. Antichrist and painted as a dangerous malcontent who will tear apart society itself. And while the prosecutor isn't wrong that an entire world of Meursaults could never function, he misinterprets Meursault as having any malicious intentions. Larry's prosecutor, on the other hand, misinterprets Larry as having egalitarian intentions. He claims Larry will tear apart society by doing good for the common man, which ends up looking equally dangerous from a law enforcement perspective. Your callous indifference and utter disregard for everything that is good and decent has rocked the very foundation upon which our society is built. Is this line spoken by the judge in Seinfeld, the judge in Curb Your Enthusiasm, or the judge in the English translation of The Stranger? It could easily be any of the three, or even a non-imaginary acquaintance berating Pink Floyd as he completes his wall. None of our protagonists are actively evil, and the judge's accusation of, quote, callous indifference and utter disregard reveals exactly why these individuals have offended the justice system, while his assertion that the manufactured and silently agreed upon standards of a given society are synonymous with everything good and decent proves that our protagonists will not be allowed to continue on their path of apathy, not so long as deviation from the norm is punished. The law is the ultimate, codified form of societal standards, and yet none of our prosecutors actually focus on the laws our protagonists have broken. In a world where failure to hold to social norms is equivalent to threatening the existence of society itself, a crime such as murder is a sufficient excuse for punishing social deviance. But while Meursault's trial is mainly focused on his mother, he does have a good reason to be there. He killed a man, after all, even if his victim wasn't given the honor of a name or any identifying mark, which itself speaks to a certain ironic apathy on the part of society's supposedly ironclad morality. Joseph K. of Franz Kafka's The Trial, which I will be referring to by the original German title, Der Prozess, to avoid confusion with the Pink Floyd song, is never told what crime he has been accused of, and the bizarre proceedings of his trial allow him to stay in his own home and go about his regular business, under the assumption that he will be present for his routine courtroom appearances and consciously consider himself an arrested man. There is no climactic courtroom scene in Der Prozess as there are in the other works we've discussed. Instead, Joseph K.'s life becomes redefined by his adherence to the Rube Goldberg machine of legal bureaucracy that sends him into bankruptcy paying his lawyer fees despite never knowing what he's been accused of. Joseph K. never comes closer to any kind of resolution, and his lawyer actively encourages to postpone his sentencing indefinitely, which would apparently happen regardless of his efforts. While Joseph K. is not lacking in emotions or empathy, and Meursault is unquestionably guilty, Der Prozess and The Stranger are both philosophical soapbox novels that primarily deal with the absurdity of the social structures developed by human beings. The Stranger depicts a legal system that values conformity to unspoken rules over the lives of individuals, especially individuals silently considered lesser, and Der Prozess depicts a legal system that is cyclical, overly complicated, labyrinthine, and set up so as to be completely unintelligible to the average person. In a word,
Kafka-esque.
in yet another series finale, another placeholder character is accused of breaking social norms and apparently nothing else. The controversial final episode of Patrick McGoohan's The Prisoner depicts protagonist number 6 sitting in on what looks like a courtroom of Illuminati-like figures who may or may not control the entire world. with number 6's unflappable spirit being regarded as the one true, pure form of rebellion, another prisoner is called to face the jury. Number 48, a young man decked out in the garb of 1960s counterculture. Number 48 escapes his bonds and gleefully runs around the room, refusing to sit still until he's addressed as a man, not a number. When the judge accuses number 48 of antisocial behavior, 48 doesn't protest his innocence. The judge acknowledges 48's age, stating that youth will rebel, quote,
against any accepted norm because it must.
Apparently allowing for a certain amount of rule bending in the interest of acting your age. However, he continues,
when the common good is threatened, when the function of society is endangered, such revolts must cease. They are non-productive and must be abolished.
Number 48's demonstrations of rebelliousness do seem pretty non-productive, as he once again starts running around the room and singing, causing the jury of faceless bureaucrats to erupt into total panic at his, quote, total defiance of the elementary laws that sustain their community. This is actually number 48's first ever appearance, and he's given no characterization besides his personal orchestrated chaos. Even when he's pronounced guilty of
the most serious breach of social etiquette
and hauled away to his punishment, his rebellious flamboyance doesn't die out. In the nearly incomprehensible science fiction, Kafka-esque political allegory and Camus-like soapbox that is the finale of The Prisoner, number 48 is more than just comic relief. He's the very essence of rebellion, the counteragent to the restrictive prison that all people are placed in by general consensus. Like Larry David and Meursault, number 48 is defined by his inability to keep his head down and succumb to peer pressure, most visible in his, quote,
refusal to observe, wear, or respond to his number.
Number 48 is fully aware of, and happily thrives in, his status as the face of this lifestyle. Unlike Larry David, number 48 has dedicated his entire being to this cause, using his mere 35 minutes of existence to embody absurdity and rebellion. What sets Meursault apart from Larry David, the Seinfeld crew, and even number 48 is his lack of a self-serving attitude. He does not follow the golden rule, but neither is he selfish. He holds an almost complete disregard for the rules of society that are silently imposed on him, though even he doesn't realize until the end of the book that the prosecutor isn't totally wrong about him. Meursault took sex and cigarettes for granted when they were readily available, but he misses them both in prison because even a sociopath like him isn't immune to bodily pleasures. This need for sensory relief does ebb, however, as Meursault shifts away from the view of himself as a free man. Unlike number 48, and of course the eponymous number 6, Meursault is not ardently opposed to defining himself as a prisoner, which is apparently enough to change even the most basic of his desires. In the same sense, imprisonment in the world of Franz Kafka amounts to hardly more than redefining oneself as an imprisoned person. Joseph K. still lives in his apartment, goes to work, and maintains his relationships, but a certain amount of stigma is attached to his new status, despite it having little effect on his day-to-day life. In fact, one of Joseph K.'s lovers, Lenny, is revealed to only be attracted to men who are on trial. She likes Joseph because he's a defendant, as revealed by a mutual friend, even though it's firmly established that neither Joseph nor Lenny have any idea what he's been accused of, how his sentencing will go, or what his punishment may be. Joseph K. struggles under the constant knowledge of being on trial, always self-sabotaging his job and his relationship with his lawyers. Meursault, on the other hand, becomes comfortable in his new role as a prisoner, taking this new development in stride the way he did everything else in his life, despite Camus' version of imprisonment being more literal than Kafka's. But when Meursault is approached by a chaplain hell-bent on converting him before his execution, he's ultimately thrown into a rage in which he decries God, religion, society, and existence itself, claiming an objective nihilism and blowing his final chance at avoiding execution. The repression of Meursault's emotions comes to a head when faced with death, while the ability to at least experience such basic feelings as happiness and fury, plus being sentenced to a year in prison, not death, allow Larry and Jerry to continue their trademark discussion of daily minutiae behind bars, both repeating the conversations from their first ever episodes, signifying, even more so than the title No Lessons Learned, that they haven't changed. Meursault, on the other hand, changes significantly after his sentencing, finally coming to embody what Camus would call the absurd, the innate human desire to find objective meaning and the lack thereof in an uncaring universe, or, in the case of Der Prozess, in a ridiculously bureaucratic system of legislation. The people surrounding our protagonists have apparently found what they believe to be objective meaning in following the standard rules of society. Larry and Jerry, on the other hand, have accepted comedy and personal intellectual pleasure as their own subjective purpose in life. Joseph K. is faced with Camus' absurdity throughout Der Prozess, but he doesn't find any sort of meaning, subjective or objective, and ends up being stabbed to death, which he regrets as being an animalistic way to die. Pink Floyd is a long way from even trying to find a purpose to his life. In fact, some fans think that the hopeful-sounding final track of the album actually implies that Pink Floyd couldn't handle the destruction of his wall and the flood of emotions that finally animated Meursault and Jerry Seinfeld, and that he took his own life instead of trying to cope. In deference to the absurd, number 48 seems to find rebellion itself to be a worthy cause, as does Meursault, at the end of his story and the end of his life. In the final words of The Stranger, Meursault rattles off an explosively emotional rant through his first-person narration. He derides the whole of existence, especially the flimsy rules propping up human society, experiencing the cognitive dissonance Camus believed would accompany a discovery of the absurd. Understanding his mother for the first time, Meursault discovers that the absurdity of an uncaring universe envelops all human beings, and he finds himself hoping for a large crowd at his execution. However, perhaps because of his newfound penchant for fury, or because he has discovered that his true pleasure comes from lording his social dissidence over others, Meursault hopes that said crowd will greet him with cries of hate. And, given the transformation we've seen in Meursault since his sentencing, the reader can rest assured that if a crowd arrives to spew hate and jeer at the accused, Meursault will have no trouble holding up the proverbial mirror and ordering them to curb their enthusiasm.